Yeah, we're gonna get started and let them drift in. After last week's business meeting, when Don was kind of walking through the budget and then explaining the Anglican Institute, one of the things I'd like to do this morning is kind of explain the lectionary commentary side of the Anglican Institute, just kind of take one small sliver of what the Anglican Institute is doing, mainly because that's the one I know most about, because I'm the person doing it. And then the second thing is, I'm going to move that direction today because in the lectionary readings, Bishop Dobbs went off script. He went rogue this morning. Yes. And he actually used readings from week 29 of year B rather than this week's readings. But I guess when you're a bishop, you get to do those kinds of things. You know, as a Sunday school teacher, you don't get those sort of options. So this morning I've got kind of two objectives. One is I want to explain the lectionary commentary side of things. But in order to do that, what I want to do is back up and explain more about the lectionary. And in the process of doing that, that material I'm going to be explaining about the lectionary will then become part of the Lectionary Commentary Series. So it's kind of like this vicious circle. What I'm explaining this morning will become part of the commentary series, and I'm going to be explaining the commentary series as well. So we'll see how this works here. In order to explain this whole thing, the Lectionary Commentary Series is really going to have a couple aims. The first one is that it's going to become a resource for clergy in preparing sermons. The second thing it's going to do is also become a resource for laity. So writing it at a level where clergy can find stuff that they would go, oh, I didn't know that about the biblical text before, or I never heard that in seminary, but also writing it in a way that if any of you want to read it, you don't feel like you need to know Latin, Greek, Hebrew, German, French, or any other of these foreign languages that commentaries like to throw in their discussions. The second point about it is that it's going to be a commentary. And a lot of times people don't understand what a commentary is. A commentary is basically an extended discussion of the biblical text, explaining what it means, its original historical context, maybe going into social or cultural background, various things like that. Some of them even look at just geography. And they're looking at how this material then helps you understand the biblical text. So one I have with my students I did a while ago is when David goes out and battles Goliath, and then afterwards in his confrontations with Saul, the biblical text spends a lot of time talking about Goliath's sword. And so I asked my students, what's the whole thing with Goliath's sword? Why does the biblical text tell, why when David flees Saul, the first place he goes is to the tabernacle and he steals the sword? And it tells you specifically he does that. Well, you need to know the historical cultural background. The Iron Age was just dawning. The Philistines down on the coast had iron technology. The Jews up in the highlands did not have it. In fact, the biblical text even tells you that the Philistines would raid the Jewish countryside to hunt out ironsmiths. They would kill them on sight because they didn't want the Jews to have this technology. What the Jews had was Bronze Age technology. So if you had a bronze sword and you went out to battle somebody who has a hardened iron sword, guess what's going to happen when you swing your swords at each other? The iron sword is going to slice right through that bronze sword. It'll cut through the shields. So this sword is incredibly important, not because so much that it belonged to Goliath, but because it was Excalibur. This was the nuclear weapon of that day. And if you had that sword, it gave you a huge leg up on the field of battle. So understanding that historical cultural background of the Iron Age and the shift in technology that's taking place there really helps. And this is the type of information that a commentary should include. Now, this commentary is going to really look at the relationships between the biblical texts. And we can talk a lot about that. There's a whole field of study called intertextuality that has very specific criteria to examine how one text is related to another text and things like that. That will be part of it. The final thing is it's going to be based on the Revised Common Lectionary, which we use. And I'm going to explain what that means as we go through here as well. So a little bit on the history of the lectionary. Where does this thing come from? First off, the lectionary goes back very early. Bishop Dobbs quoted from the Talmud today. The Talmud reaches its final form around 400 AD, but it quotes the rabbis that predate it. So it's much earlier. It'd be like picking up and reading an English Bible today, like the NIV, or the English Standard Version, and that is a translation of texts that are 2,000 years old or older. So even though the ESV was done today, it has much older material that it's working off. The same thing with the Talmud. Now in the Talmud, we have this very interesting quote. Pop up there. There it goes. And in the Talmud, it states, Moses declared to the children of Israel the appointed seasons of the Lord. This is from Leviticus 23. You can kind of see where the Talmud is a commentary on the Old Testament. Okay. Your Apple TV isn't connected to the network. Okay, Rob. You don't know what's going on. So it's on the Apple TV side of things. Sign in with your Apple ID. Yes, he does, doesn't he? There we go. All right. Get out of that. Back here. So back to the Talmud. And then the quote. That's actually a picture of a very early Talmud. It's from what we call the Cairo Genizia. It's a very old synagogue in the city of Cairo. And they were remodeling it about 100 years ago. And as they were remodeling, behind one of the walls, they found, oh, the plaster comes off, and there's this little trap door. And the little trap door that went behind the wall is what they call a Genizia. This is where the Jews would take older copies of their scriptures that had gotten worn, smudged, ripped, or torn, and they would ceremonially bury them in there and then close the trap door because they're still holy books, but they're no longer in good enough condition to keep using. So they found this one. Here's a copy of the Talmud that goes back to about 400 AD that nobody knew about for 1,500 years. But in the Talmud, it says, Moses declared to the children of Israel, the appointed season of the Lord indicates that the part of the mitzvah, and the mitzvah is a Jewish word that refers to the 618 commandments. So when you say mitzvah, that's what they're saying, the 618 commandments. The mitzvah of the festivals is that they should read the portion relating to them, each one at its appointed time. And then it goes on. It says when you celebrate Passover, you read the text from Moses about the Passover. When you have the Day of Atonement, you read the passages about the Day of Atonement. So this is perhaps one of the earliest references to the development of a lectionary, is that on certain days of the year, you are to read the appointed text related to them. Now, the early church fathers were related to this whole idea. Now, they faced two problems. One is they were related and they came out of the Jewish communities, and so what are they bringing from the Jewish communities into the Christian community? And one of the first ones that we realize is at the Lord's Supper. The institution of the Lord's Supper, Paul records this, Matthew, Mark, and Luke record it for us, that this was an institutionalized thing that was to be said every Sunday or every time they worship regarding the Lord's Supper. But they also had another problem, is that they had threats within the church and outside the church. Outside the church, pretty easy. They didn't get along well with Caesar. Inside the church, you had heretics springing up. And one of the big problems that the heretics continually brought up is this division between the Old Testament and the New Testament, whether regarding the laws or the Old Testament is Jewish and we don't get along with the Jewish community, so we need to throw out the Old Testament, or some of them argued that the God of the Old Testament was a different God than the God of the New Testament. So you have a God of judgment in the Old Testament, a God of love in the New Testament, different forms of these heresies. The way the church fathers countered this was constantly showing, whenever they exegeted a text, the relationships between the New and the Old Testament. So when Augustine, for example, reads the story of the ark, he says the ark is the body of the Lord Jesus Christ. And he goes on great things about its length, breadth, all this equaling the height and width of Jesus' body proportionally and stuff like that. But he said the ark had a door in its side. This is the wound in Jesus' side that the blood and the water gushed out of. And the ark was made of wood, just like the cross. You see what he's doing? He's taking the story of Noah and showing that it's integrated straight into the New Testament text. And he's doing it in a way that probably if somebody wrote it for a seminary class today, they wouldn't get a very good grade. But he is harmonizing the two texts. And from these exegetical and sermons that they preached, all sorts of connections started being made between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And over time, the less appropriate ones got dropped off and the more appropriate ones stuck. And I've been kind of showing you some of these as we've been going through the lessons each week. I show you how a lot of times in the New Testament authors themselves explicitly made connections to the Old Testament. Or how, for example, the Psalms made connections to the prophets. But kind of show you some of these connections. So that's what takes place in the early church. Then we come down around 350 to 400 AD. We got this guy named John Chrysostom. Now, this is really important because you know what feast day this is? This is the feast of John Chrysostom, okay? And he's got this really wild last name, Chrysostom. And it comes from two Greek words, chrysos, meaning gold, and stoma, meaning mouth. He was the golden-mouthed one. He was the orator of his day. But what takes place is John Chrysostom is one of these 800-pound gorillas within the church. He's a phenomenally brilliant person. And one of the things he does is he starts a lectionary in his churches at Antioch. Now, we don't have a copy of it anymore. In fact, I've actually read a guy's PhD, he just finished it at University of Notre Dame, where he goes back off texts of John Chrysostom's students and has attempted to reconstruct Chrysostom's lectionary. And what's very interesting is that Chrysostom's lectionary really looks like it used Matthew and Mark only of the Gospels, only Paul's letters, and the minor prophets in the Old Testament. It's this really, it's kind of like, it'd be great to have that full lectionary up to see the connections he's making, and also ask, why was he so selective in these particular things? But we could call that sort of a proto-lectionary. And then, after around 500 AD forward, we get these various lectionaries that are developed. This one is the Joharius lectionary. It's from around 1100 AD. This particular copy there, I think, is from around 1400. And I tried to do those zoom in slower so you could get a quicker view of it. But these are the lectionaries that get passed around during the medieval period. Now, a couple of things about these lectionaries is, number one, it was really hard making a lectionary. Because if you're going to make a new lectionary, it means, and they would write out the whole text. It's not like Carla just sends me a list. Here's the verses we're going to read. Or copy and paste them and then send them to me that way. No, you don't get Bible verses until around 1100. Yeah. So what they would do is if you were going to write a new lectionary, they would copy it out by hand. If you're reading John 1, they would copy out John 1. Then you would copy out Isaiah 52. Then you would copy out, and it would all be in this text. This means if you're making a new lectionary, that scribe has got to have several different books in front of him and constantly flipping back between them and copying. Very, very time-consuming and difficult. But if you had a lectionary that was already developed, it's a lot easier to copy something that's one text already and then move it forward. The other thing about these lectionaries that's very important is that these were the Bibles that were used in the churches, because these are what were read during the worship services. The Bibles themselves were like the resource books. These were back in the clergy's room, or they were in the monastery. It's not that they didn't use them, But these were the sacred books that were used really for a select few. The lectionaries were the work texts. What this means then is that as far as lectionaries go, we only have about 8 that are more than 1,000 years old, or prior to 1000 AD. And the reason's simple. These are the things that are getting used all the time. The Bibles, we actually have much older and better copy ones because these were the texts that were more preserved and reserved for special occasions. So this is some of the reasons. And one of the great things I had when I was doing my PhD was going down to Cambridge or the British Library or something like that, and actually sitting in these special reserved reading rooms and saying, oh, I'd like to see a copy of, this lectionary or this text or this medieval text. And they would bring out something from like 800 AD and sit in front of you. But then they had 2 guys standing right behind you making sure. And they would come out, they'd put down a pillow, they'd open it up, then make sure you don't have anything there except for a number 2 pencil, no eraser, just a number 2 pencil. And they made you put on white and cotton gloves for even touching it. So it was pretty cool. And then turning the pages, you say, okay, I'd like to, turn, and they would flip it with like this plastic ruler type thing for you. It was pretty cool. But here's a picture of 2 different ones. This one over here, oftentimes they're numbered L562. This is really technical theological language here. L stands for lectionary. And they give it a number so that German, French, English, Italian, Spanish, the different scholars don't have to know the names. You can say this is 562 and everybody knows what we're talking about. But see the big, what looks like a T here on this side? Right at the very top of it there, the top of the T, the line right across on the right-hand side, it says katamatheon. And that's letting you know that at this point in the lectionary, this is where we start our reading from the Gospel of Matthew going forward. And then we go forward, and they would put marks like this. Over here on the right here from Harlianus. This one on the right-hand side, this is starting in the Gospel of Mark. And they would put these kind of like illuminations or fancy texts because as Tim was asking, they didn't have verse numbers. So where do you find where your lectionary readings are? Well, you have to put kind of graphical marks in the text somehow so that the reader, when he goes up front and he's flipping through, he knows he can find where he's at quickly. So a little bit more on the history of the lectionary. These things kind of come down through us. On the Roman Catholic side, we have the Ordo Roman Missale, or Missal. This was what was used down to about 1962 by the Roman Catholic Church. And Ordo just means order or numbering. This was the ordering for the Roman Missal, what they read on Sundays in the Roman Catholic Church. Now, they read through the entire Bible every year during the course of the year. We're not quite that great. In fact, what happens in 1962 and 1965, you have the Second Vatican II Council. The first thing they do is work on the lectionary readings. And they take that one-year schedule and they break it into 3. Because obviously we're much softer today, so they had to accommodate, the weakness of the Christians. So we read through it in 3. Yes, some of them were very complex. This one had both Latin and English in it. I'll show you an early Anglican one here in a minute. Now, they developed this lectionary called the Ordo off Second Vatican II. 3-year schedule for reading through the Bible, their lectionary series. Not to be outdone, on the Protestant side, several denominations came together. Anglican/Episcopalian during that time, Wesleyan, Methodist, Presbyterian, Nazarene, I'm forgetting who else. Several came together and they formed what they called the Consultation on Common Texts. and they came out with the Revised Common Lectionary. The funny thing about it, they spent all this time. They produced the final version of it in 1992. They had what they call a Common Lectionary before that, where for about 30 years they let people comment on it and gripe or change things. And so they kind of came out with the final form in 1992, which is what we use. And each denomination has their own kind of like little tweaks and twists on this type of thing. But they came out with it in 1992, and it's a 3-year cycle. And it's based off 4 readings. Now, one of the things I hope you're grabbing from all this is that we talk about Anglicanism being rooted in tradition and history, that we are a tradition-constituted denomination. And one of the things to realize is that the order of the lectionary, this is part of the whoop and weave of who we are as Anglicans, and it goes all the way back to the Talmud and the early church fathers and Chrysostom. And it's been this rich history that comes down to us. The final form that we have right now is the Revised Common Lectionary. But one of the things that's really cool is you get these pictures, and here's one that I thought was so cool I had to put in here. This is a portrait that Rembrandt did of his mother, and the title of it is Woman Reading a Lectionary. 1630. Here she is, as a Christian, reading the lectionary readings for the day. Anyways, I thought that was too cool, so. Okay. You have to watch how many times you tap this. Now, what comes off this, the Catholic Ordo and then the Revised Common Lectionary, is that for Sunday services, we are to have 4 readings every Sunday. For the weekdays, it's 3 readings, but we're focusing mainly on Sunday right now. The first reading is an Old Testament passage. The second reading is a psalm, which is highly suggested to be responsive. Now, is it required to be a responsive reading in the Anglican side? The tradition, okay, yeah. I know it's highly, in the Revised Common Lectionary, they highly suggested that it was a responsive reading. I wasn't sure on that detail. The third reading is from one of the New Testament letters or epistles. And then the fourth reading is from a gospel text or reading. So this is the way the lectionary reading is set up. Now, to go into this a little bit more, what we have is a liturgical year. We set our year according to a calendar, and this goes way back to the early church. Because there's something really remarkable as human beings that we go through winter, spring, summer, fall, these seasons. These seasons shape our lives, my wife more so. Now that we're past December 22nd, the most godforsaken day of the year because it's so short, now days are getting longer and things are getting better. After July 22nd, the longest day of the year, and then she goes into depression because every day is getting shorter. But this is how, as embodied human beings, we live in a world that is set on a cyclical basis, and it shapes us. The liturgical year meshes with that, so what we experience through time and being human beings in the world is then meshed with our worship, and then we integrate our theology into that. Now, the liturgical year starts with Advent. As I was talking about that, the first week of Advent is the start of the liturgical year. It's not January 1st. It starts then, and then it goes around this cycle for the year. So we have Advent and then Christmas, and then after Christmas we have Epiphany, and the time after Epiphany, then we have Lent, then Easter week, then Easter, the celebration after Easter. If you're coming into Anglicanism from a Protestant denomination, Easter is not one day. Okay? Then we have Pentecost. Then we have a slight break in ordinary time. Then we have Holy Trinity. Then we have ordinary time, which goes back to the Old Latin, just like the Roman, the ordo for the missal. Ordinary stands for numbered or arranged. And so from Holy Trinity up until Advent, this is numbered or arranged time. And we follow a lot of the readings from the Old Testament and the New Testament. Oftentimes there's more order chronologically in the passage there. The other thing that we have that integrates into this is that we have 3 years, how it's broken down. Now, being great theologians and coming together for this consultation, they came up with this brilliant idea. We have got 4 Gospels, so we've got 3 years. Year A is all your Gospel readings are going to be from Matthew. Year B are from Mark. Year C, which we're in now, all of our Gospel readings are for Luke. And then being great mathematicians that you are, you realize that John is left out. Well, what happens with John is John gets integrated in every year of the lectionary. So John's Gospel's texts are read primarily during Easter time, but they are also read during Lent and Christmas. So John gets integrated into each of the years. So this is kind of the way this whole thing falls out. Now that's what we have. So my question is, what's my role here in this whole thing? Yes. A little bit on my role and how this integrates into what we want to do with the Anglican, this lectionary commentary. First off, because this is a historical and traditionally constituted form of worship and denomination within the Christian church, and the lectionary is historically and traditionally constituted, the question becomes one of how do we approach that? And the way we teach things educationally today and the way most seminaries teach things is we have us today, we use our dictionaries and historical books, and we use that to interpret the Bible. So it's a two-way dialogue, me the interpreter and B the Bible. And what happens is you end up with a 2,000-year gap between the two that we have to jump over to get back there and then find something that we can then grab and then jump back like Superman up to here. And the way we understand things and learn things, it just doesn't work that way at all. We are children that are born into a culture and tradition. How many of you chose the language you were going to speak? To be a man or a woman? To be born in the United States during the 20th century? To have the economic and social, cultural conditions that you live in? To be born into democracy? No. These are all things that we are born into, and it's what history and tradition has given to us. It's like, who was it? The Rolling Stones or something? Into this world we're born, into this world we're thrown. I forget the Van Morrison or somebody did this song. But the whole idea is that as human beings, we are born into a place in history. Now, how do we use that to understand the biblical text? Because we're part of it. We're linked to the text by this history and tradition. Well, here's where my role comes in. In 1989, I started doing a study on the history of how the end of Matthew's Gospel, Matthew 18 through 20, got interpreted. History of the Great Commission. 250 pages on 3 verses. When I was done, my conclusion was the interpretations are all over the place, and I have no idea at all what to do with this. This is a complete mess. The early church fathers are running around saying this passage teaches us about baptism, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and it's a commandment about how to do baptism. Modern church missiologists in the last 50 years say, no, this is a commission to take the gospel to the whole world. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations. The early church father doesn't talk about that at all. The modern theologians don't talk about how you baptize at all. That's just one example. We got 2,000 years of example of this debate. That started me on a quest. And one of the things I tell people that are interested in a PhD, Jesse Barklow, he's wondering about doing a PhD. I say, one of the things to know is if you're wired about PhD is, can you work on one question for at least the next 4 to 5 years and not get bored? In other words, a PhD is, this is going to date all of us, a PhD is like the old record players that get a scratch, and it just keeps going around and around and around in that one groove. That's how God makes a PhD person, okay? They just can't get out of the groove. They just keep asking that same question. So since 1989 till now, I've been working on what do we do with the history of interpretation? How do we understand it? How do we develop it? How do we do things? So some of the things that have come out of this is in 1992, I did a work on the philosophy of history and how people interpret the resurrection. Why do modern historians not accept the resurrection as a historical fact, and why do some also? And so I kind of looked at that for the past 150 years and looked at the underlying philosophy. So that was another thing in this. 1999, I completed my PhD in philosophical hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is the philosophical field of how you interpret, understand, or explain anything. It can be an artwork, it can be a form of poetry, it can be a biblical text, but I applied it to the biblical text. And in particular, I was looking at how does tradition shape and inform how we interpret a text. Next thing is, after getting the degree and teaching with Fuller Seminary, within the Society of Biblical Literature, which is kind of like the overarching guild, it's kind of like the club for all the theologian nerds. The Society of Biblical Literature, I was really involved with the interpretation, influence, and impact of the Bible. This looks at how the Bible influences and impacts cultures, but how interpretations then influence future interpretations and how they then impact culture. So was involved with that for about 10, 15 years. And during that process, I took my PhD and kind of shot more steroids into it, and then came out and published a book called Reception Theory and Biblical Hermeneutics. You don't want to read it, okay? It's an academic level book, and but this is kind of the definitive book out there right now on the subject. And then off that, I've been working in what we call the field of cognitive linguistics, which is, once again, how do we interpret. It's kind of like what I've done, but more on a more linguistic level. And the interesting thing is I've been the chair of that for the past couple years, which means that I really get to shape the direction that field is doing research in, and also to see the impact. I was talking with the publishers at Zondervan. For about the past 10, 15 years, we've been working on how do you actually interpret verbs, especially Greek verbs. And Kurt will remember going up skiing, I was kind of bouncing initial ideas off you. Yeah, he was driving too. What's interesting is Zondervan, we shifted from looking at verbs mainly talking about time to looking at how a person conceives the action, so their perspective on the verb. And the Zondervan publisher came out and he said, I want you to know, for the past, this year and going forward, we're not publishing any Greek texts that approach verbs based on time or tense any longer. We're all doing it on what we call verbal aspects. So this is one of these areas where you get to have this huge impact, because it's those texts that are going to be used in teaching seminary students how to exegete the Greek text along those lines. Now, a couple other things that go with this is during this whole project, and we're looking at doing this commentary online, there's practical things that come into concern. One is, with Fuller, they shifted to teaching online. And because I was out here on the fringes at a Colorado campus, we were the guinea pigs. You guys are going to do this main campus. We're still going to teach in the classroom, but you guys have to teach online. And I hated it at first. Looking back now, that was a godsend. I still hated it. But when you have to think about how do I teach and communicate differently online than I do in person? In other words, when I take this material and put it on the internet, I'm going to have to change it. Because what works in a classroom with jokes and things like this doesn't work on the internet. People think you're rude and obnoxious and all kinds. So you have to do changes and things like that. But that's been great. Also developing websites. For about the past 15 years, I've had to learn how to develop and code websites and things like this. And then reading the Bible with the Giants, kind of sort of the lay level book, I took and made an interactive one. And one of the things, you can get this on iPads, that I put in are these like little book things where it opens up and you can scroll through it. Another scroll through thing, or if you embed a picture in it, I can put comments about that picture. Then when you click on the picture, what happens then is it will open up into a full screen so you can look at it in great detail. And then footnotes, the same thing. Instead of having a little number there in the text and you have to go to the end of the chapter, the end of the book and see what that footnote is, what you can do is actually put the footnote right there. So these are things in this commentary that I want to put into it so it's interactive. Because if you look at most websites have this you can put video, song, music, dancing, motion, but you look at most websites when they do things, they're flat. It's like it's a piece of printed paper you stuck up on the internet. Make use of that technology. The other thing that I've got going right now is I'm writing a digital commentary for for Accordance software. And this is one of these things where it's using the databases they've got within Accordance. So when I'm talking about the city of Corinth, I can say, click on this for a picture, and I can show them a picture of like the harbors, or this, or that, or ruins of a church, or a synagogue. You can have, or if I want them to look at the Greek text, I can say, now if you've had Greek, click on this, and it'll actually open up the specific Greek text, and I can make specific points of that. Or I can do digging deeper. If a person goes, this is all the deeper I want to go, but if I want to talk about realized eschatology and how that played out in the Greek language, in 1 Corinthians, I can say, click on this, and I'll give you, I put like a 3-page discussion there, which everybody else goes, nope, too geeky. And they just move on. And then finally, the last thing is developing videos for my courses with Fuller. When we moved online, one of the things I realized is I needed to make videos to have that touch with the students. The first ones is I would take a PowerPoint presentation like this and then just voice over it. Because I didn't want anybody looking at me. I thought, this is dumb. But then I started reading and watching videos about how do you use video to teach. And so then they started having suggestions, watch this or watch that. And one of the things I kind of went, instead of watching somebody talk about this or that type thing, I found ones that, mountain biking. I'm going to watch mountain biking people. And some of these guys are really good, but if you watch them, it's like, God, that guy's a bigger dork than I am. And Catherine watched some of them and she'll go, oh, this is the guy that laughs inappropriately all the time. And it's like he's coming down a trail, and every time something dangerous comes up, he starts laughing. He's got this nervous laugh. You can just peg it and time it. But you start watching it, and then you start going, okay, what are they doing? And then you've got some other people who don't really have a lot of technical training, but they're just incredibly gifted. There's this one guy that got thrown out of his house at 15 years old, really got a high school degree, no college degree, but he's one of the leading people in talking about how do you make videos, how do you tell a story. Hollywood uses this guy. And you watch him and you go, what the heck is he up to? But the cool thing is, he tells you what he's doing and how he's doing it. And then I watch it and I go, he's doing narratology. He's explaining a basic narrative format and what's going on and things like that. So taking those things, and for the past 3 years, I've been trying to develop the video side. And what I'd like to do with this is on the websites for the commentary is have like a 5 to 10 minute video at the beginning where you get kind of the Reader's Digest of what that week's commentary is about. So it'll be on the website, but also post it on YouTube. Have a lectionary commentary page on YouTube as not only a resource to other people, but as an outreach. So that people start going, especially if they're in a more Protestant denomination that doesn't use the lectionary, or they're just considering Christianity, they can catch that and they can start going, hey, this lectionary stuff is pretty cool. Look at these biblical texts. Look at these connections. And hopefully bring people our direction across all the Anglican churches, but also, it'd be kind of cool in Colorado Springs to see people start coming here because they're watching me do something stupid on the internet. So how is this whole thing going to play out? What's going on? And this is where I'm at. I've been at this for 3 weeks now, okay? 2.5 to 3 days a week. So this is where we're at right now with where we got the finances and money and time and stuff like this. So let's start with a lectionary grant. Oh, here I was going to tell you about, we looked at the Ordo of the Roman Missal with the Catholic Church here. Here's the Sarum Missal. This one's from 1418. Sarum is the old name for Salisbury. It's the old Anglo-Saxon name for Salisbury. And this was the main cathedral that really put out the order of worship for the Church of England. In fact, this Sarum Missal, everybody goes, oh, Thomas Cranmer was such a genius. He plagiarized this sucker. He kind of took the Latin, scratched it out, and wrote English in with a crayon. No. But this became the backbone for the Book of Common Prayer, this Sarum Missal. Now, this one's really interesting. I actually saw this one at the British Library. And it was so cool that I found a picture, not the pages I was working on. But let me see if I can do this here without, is that, no. Okay, it used to have, you would get a little pointer. But over here, halfway up through the left column, you notice there's a blank section. And then over here on the right side, you see dark words kind of crossed out. These are references in the Sarum Missal to the Pope. This one was from 1418, but it got preserved longer. After the English Reformation, to be caught with a book that has references to the Pope was illegal. So these scribes went through and scratched out or crossed over the Pope's name, and then they were able to keep using the Sarum Missal. So we're going to use that, and off the lectionary readings, we have the 4 readings that come off each week. Now, we've got 52 weeks in a year. That means if I've got 4 Old Testament texts, I need to write 4 commentaries per week, times 52 weeks. That's more than 200 commentaries a year. And I want to show the connections between them. This is one of the things where I want to make it interactive. So if we're looking at the gospel and it quotes from Isaiah, I want to be able to bring those texts together so you can see the references like I do in class, where I'll highlight the words or things like this. And then we've got 3 years in the lectionary reading. This means that in the long run, we're going to have 600 pages of web commentary up. Now, I used web page because if you know me, like Sunday morning thing here, they're going to be more than 1 page long each, so that's just web addresses. The way I'm looking at organizing, I've been playing around with this for the past 3 weeks, trying Dreamweaver and WordPress and Wix and Sparkle and different Bold Grid and things like this to see what software will allow us to do this best. We'll have a home page that should say Lectionary Project Home. And then off that, we'll have like a couple basic pages. Something about the Lectionary Project. It's links to the Anglican Institute and integrate the two at that point. There will be an introduction to the lectionary, like what we're doing today, a web page along the lines of what I went through historically. And then a page that will have the index to the commentary. And it'll be broken down into years A, B, and C, and the 52 weeks. And then off that page, you'll have links then to these 600 pages that will go up over the next years being put up there. But the front page, the most recent one, or that week's page, with its 4 readings then, we'll then go back and we'll have like a good paragraph or so at the beginning, video, and then like the first couple paragraphs for that week's commentary. So if a person's looking at it, they can click read it and go, oh, that sounds interesting, and click, and it'll take them right to that page for that week's readings. So that's where I'm at and what I'm doing. But because this is St. John Chrysostom's feast, one of the things I just want to leave you with is this is a great, I love this picture, because you have Empress Eudoxia up in her kind of royal box, and then you have John Chrysostom, who's like in a preacher's pulpit stand. He was probably bound and standing before, not in a pulpit stand. But you get the history, you immediately realize that he's a preacher, he's a leader of the church, and he's confronting Eudoxia. Eudoxia didn't like his comments about the relationship between the church and state. John constantly said the church cannot be held captive to the political whims of the state, and he also constantly attacked wealth and the abuses of wealth. 2 things Eudoxia did not like. So she had him exiled to the north side of the Black Sea during winter, and then every day forced him to march in summer clothing 30 miles in the snow. until he died. So John Chrysostom is one of these people that falls in our church tradition that gives us a great example of scholarship, writing commentaries, but also being a person whose impact is even felt down to this day. So I'll close with that. Like normal, I'll be off in the fellowship hall getting a lot more coffee. And if you have questions or comments about anything I went through today, feel free to ask me. Or if you are really good with organizing and web stuff and you go, I think we can tweak the way you're organizing, I would love to hear from you guys in that regard. Amen?